Today we're here to discuss pop culture in the 1920s. So before we even get going, I've got a reflection question for you to answer. What types of people do you follow or do you consider a celebrity today? Explain your answer. So I'll give you a couple minutes to answer that. That should be the next slide that comes up. You should have a box where you can fill in your answer, and then we'll move on. So if we begin with talking about popular culture in the 1920s, we have to think, what is popular culture? Pop culture or popular culture is just simply what's popular at the time. The people who are the celebrities, as we might think of them today, so entertainers, athletes, and other famous people are what we consider popular culture today. And when we talk about the pop culture today, a lot of times we talk about the paparazzi following famous people around, but that wasn't always the case. That wasn't always what culture looked like. And so we'll take a look at what the world was like before the 20s, and then we'll move to after the 1920s as well. So if we want to talk about the 1920s, the first group of people we're going to talk about is what is known as the Lost Generation. And the Lost Generation is a group of people who, according to your textbook or the internet, if you looked it up and copied word for word, was the generation that came of age during World War I. Chances are you don't really know what that means, so let's explain it in a little bit more detail. So coming of age just really means when you kind of grew up, when you kind of became an adult. And so we generally think of that as the people who turned about 18, 19, 20 years old around the time period. And the Lost Generation is this generation of people, those people who were growing up before the war, and they really reached adulthood during the war. And a lot of times we call them the Lost Generation because many of them lost their childhood. Childhood was spent, they weren't actually fighting in the war, but World War I was going on, and it was kind of a dreary time period in history. And so when we think about the Lost Generation, we think of these people who never really got to have any fun. When we take a look at Prohibition later, a lot of the Lost Generation will fall into the group that just kind of wants to drink and have fun. The Lost Generation is a group of people that in many ways they are disillusioned with society. They look at what life is like after the war, and they look at how many people sacrificed their life during the war, how many people died in World War I, and when they all come back to America, it's the rich who keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer. And the Lost Generation believe that a lot of people are living frivolous lifestyles, especially the wealthy, that there's a lot of fake, there's a lot of arrogance among the people at the top. We look at this quote, lost means not vanished, but disoriented, wandering, directionless, a recognition that there was great confusion and aimlessness among the war survivors in the early post-war years. And so this idea is not necessarily that war was a bad thing, but everybody who grew up during the war, they don't really know what to do after the war is over, and many members of the Lost Generation will actually move to Europe and try to get away from America. They feel like the American dream is gone, the American dream is no more, and to try to live the American dream is something they're not even willing to do anymore. So many members of the Lost Generation move to Europe to carry out their future plans. Now, when we talk about the Lost Generation, we're mainly talking about writers and artists, and so some of the more famous people, F. Scott Fitzgerald, you probably know him because he wrote the book The Great Gatsby, and chances are you read The Great Gatsby at some point in time. Again, Gatsby is all about this guy who lives in sort of a wealthy upper class neighborhood. This house that you see, or mansion or castle almost is what it looks like, was actually what F. Scott Fitzgerald was imagining when he came up with the setting for The Great Gatsby. But again, we start to see this Lost Generation, this group of people like Fitzgerald who look at the wealthy and they say, man, this life is crazy, and why am I not living a life like that? How come the wealthy keep getting wealthier and the poor keep getting poorer after the war? Another person who was a writer during the time, member of the Lost Generation, Ernest Hemingway, one of the most famous poets and writers of all time. And maybe his book that deals with the Lost Generation the most is what we would call A Farewell to Arms, where he basically talks about his experiences during World War I. And so again, if we want to think about the anti-war world, or we want to think about somebody who wants to give up the past and sort of move on, Hemingway says there's nothing noble in being superior to your fellow men. True nobility lies in being superior to your former self. Again, this is part of the generation that's just sick and fed up with, disillusioned with American society after the war. The rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer, and the extravagance of America, essentially the roaring part of the roaring 20s. Now, if we're going to look at the roaring 20s, we know that the 20s did roar, but they really only roared in the big cities. It was mainly in the urban areas where the 20s were roaring. The 20s weren't doing a whole lot of roaring in the rural villages. Life was still pretty old school back then in many of the villages, and so it's really the urban areas, the big cities, that experienced the roar at the beginning of the 20s. This happened in fast-paced lifestyle. However, that doesn't mean that rural areas were completely left out. As we start to see invention of modern technologies such as the radio, we start to see people becoming more connected on several different levels. So people in rural areas, by listening to the radio, can in many ways relate to people in the urban areas. We start to see a huge change in the way people live their lives. Now, that's not to say that farmers were completely connected with the urban area. There still was a huge urban and rural divide, but the radio is providing one more means for people to connect. The radio also provides a level of family bonding. So families, the way we sit around and maybe watch TV together with our families, back in the day, people would have sat around the radio and they would have listened. And so again, not only does the radio connect the urban with the rural area, but it's also a way for families to show some bonding and some togetherness time. So maybe you and your family can go home and listen to the radio. The radio wasn't just about listening to radio programs. It wasn't just about news or sports or music, mainly what the radio is today. But back in the 1920s, the radio would have also had comedies and dramas and other types of programs that today we would see on TV. Back then was presented through the radio. Now, another thing that we see in the 1920s is really the rise of celebrities and the rise of famous people. Sure, there were famous people before the 1920s, but the idea of the celebrity, the type of person we worship and we idolize and we follow the way we follow celebrities today, that really didn't exist before the 1920s. Sure, there were famous people, but people didn't really care what they were doing outside of their famous lives. People didn't care what was going on. Today we know we have the paparazzi who follow celebrities around everywhere they go, and a lot of this originated with the 1920s. And so during the 1920s, some of the most famous people were athletes. You can see Babe Ruth, probably the most famous baseball player, and even when we talk about sports in the 1920s, we're mainly talking the largest sport of the time is, so baseball would have been huge in the 1920s, boxing would have been huge in the 1920s. Other sports like football and hockey, and to a lesser extent basketball, are on the rise in the 1920s, but really it's the baseball stars and the boxers that are the heroes of the day, and people would have followed their every move. Of course, people involved in entertainment, whether it be not TV, but with the movies at the time, or people listening on the radio, entertainment becomes huge in the 1920s. And then finally, something that we think of as a little bit weird, transportation heroes. Today, we probably don't think too much about famous people in transportation. Maybe you've seen the recent movie Sully, about Sully, the pilot who landed the plane in the Hudson River and saved all those lives. But other than him, most of us don't really know much about aviation heroes. But back in the early days of flight, remember 1903 is when the Wright brothers first took to flight. Here we are in World War I, and after World War I, and flight has become a little bit more advanced, but it's still kind of a new thing. And so anybody who's involved in it is, in many ways, considered a hero. And among the tops of them, we see in the photo, we see Charles Lindbergh. And Charles Lindbergh was the pilot of the Spirit of St. Louis. You want to check out that plane, they have it at Henry Ford Museum, at least a replica of it. And Charles Lindbergh really was a famous aviator during the 1920s. So we'll take a look at a video of pop culture during the 1920s.
Then the Manasseh Mauler lashed out in his old ferocious style. Several fast, deadly punches.
In a decade fraught with so many changes, people in the 1920s seemed hungry for old-fashioned heroes, and an explosion in spectator sports provided them. Sports giants became household names, their every move followed by radio and an eager tabloid press. One name was known in more households than any other.
In our family, we were never baseball-oriented, but I would have had to be deaf not to have heard about Babe Ruth.
George Herman Ruth, the Babe, reshaped America's pastime. In an era of big events, he excelled at the game's biggest excitement, the home run. He hit 60 of them in a single season in 1927, a record that would stand for 4 decades. Fans drove from miles around to see him. The public's fascination with flying in the 1920s seemed fitting for a time when even gravity couldn't hold down progress, and when every boundary seemed just waiting to be broken. In 1927, one pilot would put aviation and himself on every front page in the world. On a misty May morning outside New York City, a plane called the Spirit of St. Louis was ready to take off for Paris. No one had ever flown solo across the Atlantic before. 6 others had tried, failed, and died. Ready to take the chance this time was Charles Lindbergh, the 6'2" son of a former congressman from Minnesota. Thousands of people came to watch him take off. Once he was out of sight, it seemed as if all America held its breath.
In Yankee Stadium, they had 3 minutes of silence, praying for him. Everybody in the country was praying for him.
Flying the fuel-heavy single-engine plane was a battle against weather, hunger, and fatigue. For the entire 33-and-a-half-hour flight, the Western world wondered about the fate of that tiny plane somewhere over the vast Atlantic.
It was a Saturday night. They hadn't heard from him for a long time. And I was walking up 125th Street and someone shouted, "They found him." He was flying over Ireland, and within an hour or so, he landed in Paris.
100,000 Parisians were there to welcome the shy young pilot. Lucky Lindy emerged from his plane carrying only a razor and a passport. His flight had represented the best of an era, a mastery of modern technology joined with old-fashioned values of courage, individualism, and hard-won achievement.
So now that we've taken a little bit of a look at Lindbergh and what made him famous, we're going to look at Lindbergh the celebrity. If you're at home, chances are if you check out your schedule, we're probably going to watch the video in class tomorrow. However, if you missed class the day that we watched Lindbergh kidnapping video, you may want to check it out. I think there's a link on Moodle towards it. So we'll watch the video in class. If you missed that day in class, you can watch on Moodle. That concludes our discussion of popular culture in the 1920s. Have a wonderful day.